Police Commissioner.
We will never tolerate violence, property damage, or disruption of emergency services. And as we've said, once the university asks for our help, the NYPD will be there ready to assist them.
A failed asylum seeker has become the first to be flown to Rwanda as part of a voluntary removal scheme. It's separate to the government's flagship deportation plan and comes with a payment of up to £3,000. A Labour tabled motion of no confidence in the Scottish government is set to be debated later. The party is pressing ahead despite the resignation of First Minister Humza Yousaf on Monday. In the city, the FTSE 100 is just reopening at 81.44 after closing down 2 yesterday. The pound buys $1.24 and €1.17. LBC weather, bright spells for many parts of the UK, cloudier in the east with some heavy rain further south later, a high of 20 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Thomas Watts.
Well, if you knock this wall through, you could open plan the living area.
So I'm thinking burnt ochre paired with some terracotta tiles, very in season right now.
When it comes to making big decisions for how we improve our homes, we rely on the advice of experts. So shouldn't it be the same for the way we heat and power them? At EDF, we're specialists in low-carbon technology for homes. We've installed thousands of air source heat pumps, solar panels and batteries across the country. And we also have useful content to help you make the right decision for your home. Search edfenergy.com/energy specialist to find out more.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning. It's 2 minutes after 8 on Wednesday, May the 1st, and it is Caller Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley who's in the studio with me now. Normally, Sir Mark, of course, we would start with going straight to the calls, but we can't in light of the extraordinary events yesterday and the bravery shown by your officers. Obviously, there's many details that you cannot share with us at this stage. What can you tell us, Sir Mark?
It was horrific, wasn't it? And the first thing you have to say is for the parents involved who've lost their 14-year-old, that is just horrific, and it's everyone's worst nightmare, and I'm sure we're all thinking about them. So we were on the ground in 12 minutes, and he was detained after 22 minutes. Obviously, some of the first contacts led to officers being very severely injured.
What can you tell us about the extent of the injuries, Sir Mark?
I mean, we talk, don't we? People say sort of officers run towards danger. What you've actually seen on some of the videos that are out sort of around social media and on news sites such as your own, you actually see what that really looks like. You've got officers running towards someone who's waving a sword. I went to the hospital yesterday and to see the officers and their families. I saw the inspector whose hand's badly damaged. I saw him before the operation. He was in good spirits. I think that was partly the morphine, to be honest.
Right, okay.
But he's got sort of a lot of patching up to be done on his hand, really serious injuries there. And I was talking to the family and colleagues of the officer, woman officer who's really badly damaged arm, really seriously damaged, and the surgeon spent sort of many hours sort of basically putting her arm back together. It'll be a long journey of recovery.
One newspaper said of the female officer it was close to her actually losing her hand. Are you able to confirm that?
That's not a million miles away. I mean, it's really horrifically serious injuries. I was in hospital 3 weeks ago with another officer who'd been stabbed. I find sort of going and seeing these young men and women, they are mostly in their 20s, they're the same age as my kids, and they're going out doing the most extraordinary things. I find it massively humbling that they're so connected to the mission of protecting the public.
Yeah.
What they do is absolutely extraordinary, and it's a privilege to work with them and lead them.
We'll move on in a second. Will these injuries be described as life-changing?
So, based on what the surgeon was saying yesterday, we're sort of increasingly optimistic that with sort of months and years and lots of physio, that sort of full recovery may be possible. It's too early to say that, but sort of.
This is the female officer who's in a more. I mean, they're both serious, but more serious.
It's too early to be certain about that. But the sort of the surgeon was just the most professional and sort of humble guy, and he was sort of.
So they
was pleased with how it's gone.
Effectively join all the nerves.
Lots of repair work. It's extraordinary what they do. So I think he spent hours and hours sort of operating under microscopes, sort of reattaching nerves and vessels and things. Just extraordinary.
Come on, I've got to get a word from you on the bravery of the men and women who work for you.
I say they're just extraordinary. I find it humbling that sort of, they will run towards danger, but that's not a glib phrase. That's real. They're charging towards somebody with a sword. They're putting themselves at risk because they are so connected to the idea of it's their job to protect the public, and they do that sort of day in and day out. I mean, meanwhile, every day in London, on average, 19 officers are injured. 19 officers a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's the background of the conflict of officers making arrests at domestics, on the streets when they confront violent people. That's the routine, and tragically, from time to time, some of those injuries are really serious, like we saw yesterday.
These two officers we're speaking of, did they have tasers?
So some of the officers involved did. I'm not sure whether those two.
The two that sustained serious injuries, did they have tasers?
I can't remember. Sorry, I'm not going to make up the facts. But so some officers who you saw on some of the video detaining did have tasers. So all officers have the incapacitant spray, and some officers are taser trained. And we're currently reviewing whether we should have wider access to tasers for officers. But neither of them are perfect solutions. No. Sometimes people in mental health crisis, particularly the incapacitant sprays, don't work. The incapacitant sprays are difficult in a confined environment because everyone gets a dose of it, and the tasers, you've got to have two barbs make contact with the skin. So neither of them are perfect, but we are looking at whether we issue them more widely.
The numbers I have are, you currently have a strength of personnel of around 34,000, of whom around 7,500 are taser trained, carrying tasers. The Mayor said in 2022, in his view, it should move more to like 10,000, and that is an active operation. Are those the figures you recognise, Sir Mark?
I do recognise those figures. So you wouldn't expect it to be anywhere near 34,000 because I know our counter-terrorism detectives, for example, aren't going out confronting dangerous people on a sort of daily basis. But for some officers, it makes sense. The officers who are out on patrol, responding to difficult calls on the streets, some of them have it. We're looking at whether more of them need it.
Do we need more officers with guns on the streets?
These incidents always provoke that thought. Our armed policing teams are massively important at confronting some of the most dangerous. I'm not someone who's a fan of the idea of moving towards sort of fully armed policing. I think we should be proud of our model that we police the streets and we keep them safe with a largely unarmed model. And I think that's something to be envied and protected.
Lastly on this, you'd want a higher ratio, wouldn't you, than roughly 1 in 3 officers carrying a taser? As the way the streets are going for their own protection? Even if you got to 10,000 out of 34, it's not even 1 in 3, Sir Mark.
But it's the patrol officers. It's the patrol officers. Okay. It matters rather than the total number. So if you're doing sort of fraud investigations or cyber work, you don't need a taser. But we are looking at the numbers, and they may well go up.
All right. And lastly, on the incident in Hainault, it's being reported that the man in detention has some kind of family link in that area. Can you comment on that, Commissioner?
No. So obviously that investigation continues. He's in custody. The detectives will be interviewing him, and we'll see where that case goes.
Is there anything more you can say about that?
I'm not going to say any more about the investigation. No, it's live investigation.
All right. I've taken too much of your time. The idea is you take calls from folk, and first through, and this is something that I particularly want to address you on as well. Jonathan is in Finchley. You're through to the Commissioner. Go ahead with your question, Jonathan. Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning, Nick. Good morning, Sir Mark. And first of all, our thoughts obviously are with the brave officers who were injured at Hainault yesterday.
Thanks, and
please send our best wishes. I absolutely agree with you about the bravery of police officers. We did a counter-demonstration to an anti-Israel demonstration in May 2021. We were saved by the police. The guy was convicted for violent disorder, but the police saved us. So I absolutely endorse that. And I 100% support you about the incident at the anti-Israel march on the 13th of April. He was just trying to... Anyway,
Can I move? I'm sorry to be rude. I'm not being glib, but can I move you to your question, Jonathan?
Nick,
Thank
my
you,
question.
Sir.
So, Mark, do you have everything you need in terms of legislation, in terms of the numbers of officers? Probably no to the second, but do you have everything you need in terms of legislation to deal with these marches on Saturdays? For example... the water cannons. Do you think you need water cannons? Other European countries have them. Is that something that you would welcome?
Let's go to Sir Mark Rowley.
So thank you for your support, Jonathan. In terms of first of all resources, I would like us to be a bigger organisation. New York spends 50% more per capita on policing than is done in London, and that is indicated by the stretch that we have on the streets. In terms of powers, we have had conversations with government about particular issues around sort of gaps in the law, which they've closed for us, and that's been really useful. In terms of sometimes when people ask this question, forgive me putting words in your mouth, Jonathan, they're thinking that the law should be more restrictive about the number of protests and how that can happen. That's not something for me to have a view on. If Parliament decides it wants to be more restrictive on protests, that's for them.
Would you welcome water cannons, Sir Mark?
I published a I published a report reviewing the riots I published a report in 2012 where we concluded then that we thought there was maybe every decade or so there was disorder so serious that water cannons would be useful. But it's not something you'd use routinely, and it wouldn't be relevant to the protest that we're seeing at the moment.
But you still see a role for water cannon on the occasional instance.
I put my name to a report in 2012 where we said that, and I still stand by that. But I don't think that's relevant to these protests. I think Jonathan, the challenge on these protests is that I do realise that for Jewish communities, regardless of how well they're policed, and we could have a conversation about that, they are creating a sense for Jewish communities of fear, and I do recognise that. And that's why we've used all the powers we have to full extent. So we put conditions on the marches, start times, end times. We restrict them really tightly, their sort of arrival, their dispersal, and we put a lot of policing into that so that they have no overspill effect on others. And also, on individual cases, every time someone breaches the law, the officers are pouncing on it straight away. And
let me indeed. So, if I may, Jonathan, thank you. I'm going to steal a minute of your time, but Sir Mark, you facilitated my attending the Central Command Centre in South London last Saturday, when you had around 1,300 men and women out on the streets, and you had about 120, 130 people at the Central Command. Two or three things struck me. One was the incredible sense of calm. And I'm only saying it, so listeners will be furious, but I've got to call it the way I see it. The incredible sense of calm, the professionalism with which the officers dealt with everything, the amount of planning that had gone in, how Gold Command works with Silver Command. But here's the thing that struck me. There was one incident when 10 people arrived at the Enough is Enough demonstration, around 10 people. And your men and women had seen them arrive and were on the game. And then they were trying to gain access to an area where you're not allowed to go. And a fairly young officer stopped them and was talking to them. And suddenly, it was as if she was a football manager who'd won the FA Cup. There were not just mobile phones, Commissioner, there were actual video cameras. So you then have to deploy officers to video these people who are videoing your officer. Look, I'm all about accountability. You should be accountable. Isn't there an issue of intrusion now about that woman and other officers trying to do her job?
Yeah, we're definite for accountability. 10 years ago, I led the programme to roll out body-worn video in London. It was the biggest rollout in the world at that stage of 30,000. So we're completely up for accountability. I have no problem with people filming officers on the streets. But when you have 6 or 10 people literally in your face, when you're trying to have a conversation with you, it's actually physically intrusive, and I think it escalates some of the situations. Officers in those situations, what they're trying to do, and Jonathan, you say you've been on some counter demos yourself, we want people to have their democratic right to to protest, to shout at each other, all the rest of it. We're simply concerned about keeping people who have very divergent opinions a safe distance apart. That might be 10 metres or whatever, depending on the circumstances. That's all we're trying to do in these circumstances. And an officer managing that with someone who's looking to be more provocative and trying to have a sensible conversation doesn't need 10 cameras in a face.
Finally, on the point Jonathan made, can you point to measures you're taking to try and build trust with the Jewish community? The Prime Minister said last week he has full confidence in you and you're going to be doing more in that area.
So we're doing we're doing an enormous amount. So since the 7th of October, we've been putting extra patrols in Jewish communities. We've been doing it around schools, around synagogues. We've been dealing with the surge in hate crime that Jewish communities have faced, and people will have seen some of the, maybe online, that worrying incidents of those pretty unpleasant young men getting out of a car and approaching a man who's dressed in conservative Jewish dress, in a pretty threatening way. People will have seen we arrested them within a few hours yesterday. So we are on the case of all of these, and we're putting them out there. And also, the same preventative tactics we're using to keep marchers apart, we're using to protect Jewish communities. So we have had once or twice over the last few months groups looking to drive convoys of cars waving Palestinian flags through Jewish communities in North London. We've stopped that. Right. It's not that driving a car with a flag's illegal, but you're not going to do it in a place where it's provocative and unpleasant for those who live there.
All right. Let's go to calls of a different area. Thanks, Jonathan. Sarita's in Wandsworth. Sarita, your call. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to ask...
Good morning,
Good morning. I wanted to ask, I was a victim of stalking many, many years ago when the regulations and laws were not so tight. And the way the police dealt with it was to say, look, we can't do anything. Unless he's a danger to himself or to you, there's not much we can do, which meant somebody had to get hurt. Fast forward into the future, the laws are much tighter. Stalking seems to be taken much more seriously. So why am I reading in the news that 4 out of 5 cases are being misidentified by the police as not even being stalking cases? Why is the situation worse now?
And according to findings from the Susie Lamplugh Trust Commissioner, little under 2% of reports of stalking to police end in any form of conviction. That's the year ending March 2022. How seriously do police take stalking?
So we take stalking very seriously. Stalking
Not
is...
the way Sarita says it, though.
Stalking is a precursor often to physical violence, and in itself it's very intimidating and upsetting for the victims of it. We have a stalking threat assessment centre that's looking at all of our cases and assessing the most dangerous individuals. We are, I think, one of the leaders in the country in terms of the number of preventative orders. There are stalking and harassment protection orders you can take out on offenders to put controls around them, and if they breach them, that increases the severity of sanctions. And we follow through on the cases. So it's massively important. Violence against women and girls is a growing issue in terms of what's reported to us, which is positive. And the reporting of offences of sort of sexual assault through to stalking have quadrupled over the last decade. We're putting hundreds of more officers and staff into that area, and we're both trying to do the best we can to respond to the crimes and prosecute as many as we possibly can do, as well as identify the most dangerous offenders and go after them and put them in prison.
This is very much part of conversation. Have you seen this TV series called Baby Reindeer, which is making the headlines?
I haven't seen that one, sorry.
No, that's okay. Okay. So this is about a real-life stalking incident, but a report in March found that 80% of stalking cases in London were wrongly categorised for almost 8 years. This obviously gives concern that Met officers are failing to spot the harm when it's there, Commissioner.
So there are two different types of stalking offence, and it's quite a fine nuance between them, and there are different opinions about how they should be categorised. They are being recorded as stalking, and they are being dealt with. Whether they're classified as Type A or Type B, I don't think is the most important issue. The most important issue is, are they responded to, and are we protecting victims, which we are.
Sarita, thank you. Aaron's in Gillingham. Aaron, I think you want to take us back to events in East London. Morning to you.
Yes. Good morning.
Hi,
Nick.
Aaron. Yeah.
Yeah. My question is, it's about the poor boy who got stabbed with the sword. My question is, how is it going to be policed? Because I can walk into any superstore in the UK and buy any sort of knife and then potentially hurt someone with it. Not that I would want to, but how are you going to police it? It doesn't matter if you ban swords, ban zombie knives. There was always potential of me getting something to hurt somebody with. So how would it be policed?
Well, of course, it's worth saying before I hand over, Aaron, there are laws in place that prevent you from walking around the streets with a sword or a machete or a zombie knife or whatever. But let's go to the Commissioner. Sir Mark.
So you're absolutely right. We can't. You can't ban every knife. We all have lots of dangerous weapons in our kitchen. So there is a limit to what bans can do. They are helpful, though. Some of the sort of horrific weapons that gangs are using, some of them have been banned. The government's moving the law to increase that, and there's always scope for possibly tightening up on that.
But this specific sword will not be included in legislation in September. How concerned are you about that? Zombie knives will be, but a samurai sword, I'm no expert in the field, but a samurai sword won't, Commissioner. How concerned are you?
It may be possible, but I'd more think about the policing of it. So how do we confront these issues? So we have a range of tactics. So firstly, we identify the most dangerous people who are in gangs, and we go after them and we try and put them in prison. We sort of target hotspots. So across London, most of London doesn't have any knife crime. Sort of some data I saw recently, more than two thirds of London doesn't have any knife crime. So it's
seriously,
yeah. So it's concentrated in a small number of locations, and so we put.
Are you doing that borough by borough just to work out how you get 2/3?
Smaller than that. So put a small grid over London,
right.
Sort of small areas, and you find that 2/3 doesn't have any knife crime at all.
Right.
London is. So in terms of serious violence, London is safer than sort of Birmingham, Manchester. It's safer than West Yorkshire. So there's a lot of political heat.
You know those figures are a fact, because I'm looking at you with a degree of incredulity, but you wouldn't be saying it if you didn't know.
No, serious violence, okay. We are safer than the other cities. So, okay. But it's not perfect, and there's always a lot more to do. We've had some success in the last year in terms of the violence against sort of knife violence under 25 has been reduced. We've reduced shootings in London. So we're having some successes, but in other areas like sort of knife-enabled robbery has gone up. So we've got work to do. So we patrol those small number of areas which have the highest number of crimes, and we're looking at whether we can enhance our use of stop and search there. We're using new technologies like facial recognition in those areas to arrest wanted offenders, because it's fantastic at spotting people who are wanted. So we're using a range of tactics to keep bearing down on this, because it does concern us all. Right. But don't believe everything you read in the papers that it's completely out of control.
Aaron, thank you. Mohammed is in South Shields. Mohammed, your question to the Commissioner. Go ahead, sir. Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Commissioner. My question is, with the police being an amazing job that they're doing, if anything goes wrong, the police are in a bad situation. They'd be damned if they do, they'd be damned if they don't. Do you think the government support the police? Because I don't see that. I just don't see any support for the police whatsoever, either from the public or the government whatsoever. I mean, like I say, there'd be poor souls would be damned if they do, and they'd be damned if they don't.
How would you characterise the level of support you enjoy from senior politicians, Commissioner?
Mohammed, thanks for the question. Thanks for your support. The support of communities and politicians really matters to officers, because they're going out there into risky and dangerous situations day in and day out, and they need to feel that support. Candidly, I mean, there was a Federation survey only sort of a couple of weeks ago published, which showed that officers' perception is that support from politicians particularly isn't there.
Do you concur with that?
That's their view, and that matters. And I think it's really important that they feel supported. Now, I know some of this people will say you've got some rogue officers. We're sorting those out. But meanwhile, the 99% who are going out doing things like we saw yesterday, we all, as you're implying in your question, Mohammed, they all need to feel that they've got our support. And in those difficult situations, people aren't going to afterwards pour over them unfairly and say, well, yeah, why do you use the taser like that? Why didn't you do it like this? Why didn't you do it like that? Because in those fast-time situations, you can see how threatening and difficult it is. And sometimes the accountability regime means that they're poured over unfairly afterwards. And we've talked about that before publicly. And the government's been thinking about whether they can change some of the rules around that. And I hope that can move quickly.
Just moving on from Mohammed's question, expanding it a little bit, Commissioner, how fair is some of the criticism that's been levelled at your officers and at times you for handling of the protests? There's been concern over the display of the words from the river to the sea up the side of Big Ben. There were suggestions that officers asked about the context of a swastika. How do you want to address those?
So, Nick, I brought something with me I was going to talk about. So, some of this
You're opening your mobile phone just to explain what's happening.
Yeah, so some of this stuff is offensive, and some of it's really completely illegal. If you're using swastika or any other Nazi sort of comparisons in the context of these protests about the Middle East crisis, that is going to be an offence. You're going to be arrested, and we've done that in every.
But the officer did ask for a context, didn't he?
Every single occasion. The officer was trying to give a rounded answer, which in hindsight might not have been the best thing when it clipped on social media. We have seen on protests that are pro-Ukrainian people comparing Putin's regime to the Nazis. Now, we're probably not going to arrest people for that,
right?
Because it's a different context. So that's the point. But on the context that you're thinking about in terms of people protesting about what's going on in the Middle East, any sort of Nazi comparison is going to be illegal, going to make arrests. But some of what's out there, it is contentious and offensive, but that doesn't mean it's illegal. I've pulled out a quote from a case, and this is an odd thing to do on a radio thing, but I think it captures free speech.
Go ahead.
Free speech includes not only the inoffensive, but the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome, and the provocative, provided it doesn't tend to provoke violence. Freedom only to speak inoffensively is not worth having. Now, as a journalist, Nick, if I said to you...
May I ask who said that's from a court case?
Lord Justice Sedley in a court case, which is about actually police overreaching in terms of at Speaker's Corner.
Sorry, back to your point, you wanted to address me as a journalist. Go ahead.
So as a journalist, if I said, we're going to change the law so you're not allowed to be irritating, contentious or eccentric...
I'm out of a job.
Exactly. So that's the challenge. Now, some of what people have seen on the protests fits those labels, and that's upsetting to communities. We recognise that. That's why we're policing the protest tightly, but it's not illegal, and that's the challenge that we're wrestling with the whole time. But I do realise, from a Jewish community perspective, it's quite difficult.
A point well made, but I'm going to come back if you don't mind.
Of course.
Big Ben. Why was that projection allowed to stay for so long, Sir Mark?
It wasn't allowed to stay for so long. It was up for a few minutes. I'm going to say 10 from the back of my mind. I may have misremembered that. But it wasn't just that. They went through a cycle of things. It was there was a peace dove, there were various other things, and then it turned to the River to the Sea quote. Officers were looking for the source of the projection. They found it. There was no one with it. They switched it off. So it wasn't allowed to continue. All the assessments and all the legal advice we've had, it is offensive. I know to many Jews find it offensive. It's not illegal, but it was turned off.
All right, let's go to some of the text, tweets and emails. David in Fulham, why isn't more being done to help the little girl who lost her life in the Wimbledon school crash? I would imagine, of course, this is the tragedy that took place in, I think it was July of last year, involving the young girl. I think she was 6, 7 or 8, and the Land Rover that drove into the school. You'll be aware of the case.
Yeah,
there is a suggestion. Why are we not doing that? Where are we on that case? Have charges been brought?
So the investigation is still continuing. The reporting that I'm guessing the questioner has picked up is that the family have understandably pushing us to go more quickly. A forensic collision investigation is a very sort of complex sort of discipline within policing, looking at all the data from police computers, from car computers rather, looking at all the sort of data from the crash, looking at skid marks. It's quite a complex process. We have to have people with sort of degree level qualifications who get trained in it to do it, and our team that does that needs to be bigger, but we're trying to grow it, but it takes a long time to train them, and because of that they're working through all their cases, and this case hasn't been as quick as it should do. I'm sorry about that, but we're going to move it as quickly as we possibly can do.
Why? We had 2 girls who've lost their lives here. I don't need to tell you, because I know you take these things personally, and you've addressed that with your angel. Why is it taking so long, Commissioner?
But the officers doing this case are the only cases they're doing are cases where people have lost family members.
Right.
So it's not being put behind other cases where people have lost lives. It's a complex discipline. We're trying to put more resources into it, but it takes time to train them up.
How common is it we wait 10 months before any charges might be brought in the death of 2 girls struck by a motor car? Is that common?
It's common that a lot of these cases where fatal road accidents are taking many, many months to get to conclusion because of the complexity of the investigation and the qualifications we need to be able to provide the evidence. Right. It's not as good as it should be. I'm not pretending it is.
Can you tell me when you hope there will be definitive action for the parents?
We're trying to find if there's a different way than the existing way to get people trained, because the current way takes several years at university courses, and we're trying to find a different way around that to get them the skill set to do it.
So in these particular instances, I'm getting the names in Noura Sajad and Selina Lau. I mean, some charges by next month?
We've written back to the family recently talking about the timescales, and I can't remember them in my mind, though.
Well, I've got a note here. It was the end of April, so we just passed it as of today. So we've missed that deadline. End of May?
We've written back to them. I'm not sure that's the exact date, but
all right. Okay.
We've written back to them.
All right. Colin's in Newcastle. Moving towards our last question. Colin, go ahead.
Hello, Nick. Good morning, sir.
Hello,
I'm an old-time police officer. I'm actually a black police officer with teenage boys. So, as the phrase goes, I've got skin in the game. So I'm just putting that because you've got to understand where I'm coming from. The only time the only time knife crime has fallen was between 2010 and 2015 when we used extensive stop and search. The modern method of the multi-agency mental health approach clearly hasn't worked. I'm fearful that what could happen to my boys. So I don't mind my boys being stop and search if it reduces knife crime, and it has worked. So is there any chance of going back there? Because I don't want to end up burying my kids.
Where are you on stop and search? And that's one copper to another there and a dad to another. Sir Mark.
Yeah. Colin, thanks for the question, and I 100% agree with you. Stop and search does work. It's been falling over sort of the last 2 or 3 years. Some of that, frankly, is about officer confidence and some of the issues that we've talked about earlier.
When you say officer confidence, they fear what?
They feel complaints and the support the investigation they get, and whether they feel supported behind it. We're looking at ways to increase our stop and search, and we're making some announcements on that in the next couple of months and targeting on those areas. I think the most important thing, we have to break the culture of people carrying knives, and part of that has to be a fear of being caught. What some people would say to us is, though, it's about how it's done. And so part of us doing more of it will need to include how we do it, so that the young people who are stopped and searched don't feel it's an unfair process.
What happens to me? So I'm brave enough to sign up as a copper. I stop someone. They then say, Officer Ferrari stopped me because I'm black and he behaved in a shocking fashion. Am I immediately suspended? What happens to me?
You're not only suspended, but then you're sort of under investigation, notices are served whilst that investigation continues. And that can sap your confidence to act.
Dead right.
And
I say to my Governor, I did it right.
Exactly. Even though it will be on body-worn video and can be watched quite quickly, often these processes take too long and sometimes get escalated by by public pressure. And before you know it, officers start to lose their confidence. So there's a real fine balance here, because I'm not someone who pretends that we're 100% perfect, and we're not. And scrutiny is very, very important. But just as Colin says, and just as I think his experience was as an officer, you want the confidence to go out there and stop and search those who are at risk of carrying knives and doing it fairly and properly. And we're going to be launching a stop and search charter, which is being worked up with young people in London about how it's done. I think the most powerful thing...
When will that be?
Say in the next couple of months, we're going to be changing our approaches. I think the most powerful thing about stop and search, there's lots of contentious views in communities, and particularly it's particularly sad in black communities who are the greatest victim of knife crime. A statistic you'll have heard me mention before, probably, young black men in London growing up are 13 times more likely to be murdered than young white men. 13 times. That's horrific. We need to come together to solve that problem. Part of the answer is stop and search, done properly and fairly and compassionately by police. And the thing that's most powerful is mothers who've lost their sons always say, why can't the police do stop and search? That's why we have to do it. We have to find a way to do it compassionately with the support of the communities, and you'll hear more of that in the next couple of months.
Colin, thank you for your question. Final question from me before I let you go, and thank you for staying an extra couple of minutes. I do appreciate it. You might have seen an investigation by the Daily Mirror into the Jill Dando murder, and they have found someone who believes that it could be the twice-convicted murderer Milorad Lemik, who was working on behalf of the Serbian government when Jill Dando lost her life in 1999. Can you remind the listeners, is that still an active investigation? Where are we with that?
That's not an active investigation at the moment. And
are you aware of this suggestion?
So
this is supposedly a Serbian Secret Service agent.
I've read the entertaining news copy, but we've got investigations to do. We have 300 cold cases going back about 40 or 50 years so we solve like between 95 and 100% of murders, but over 40 or 50 years you end up with 300 that are sort of cases still to be solved. We put resource into solving them. You report on some of them time to time. When you get a case 25 years ago where we've got somebody from a new DNA break or whatever, our officers who are doing those cold cases, we target them where there's opportunities, not where there's good media headlines.
So just by your use of the word, and as officer you choose your words carefully, by the use of the word entertaining, you're not setting much store by this investigation?
Not at the moment, no.
Come full circle, can I just say, and I know this is on behalf of all my listeners, can you again send our thanks and best wishes to those two officers who acted so bravely up in Hainault yesterday, Commissioner? No,
they're great examples of the thousands of men and women who are out there today doing amazing things, confronting dangerous people. And it's a privilege to lead them and work with them. And I'm grateful for the support I hear from your callers and yourself, Nick. Thank you.
Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Met, appearing here on LBC, where at 8:34 we need the latest headlines.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner has told Nick the two officers injured in the Hainault sword attack have a long journey to recovery. Sir Mark Rowley's revealed they were very severely hurt when confronting an attacker yesterday morning. One male officer has serious hand injuries and a